I'm going to start with a whole bunch of apologies and disclaimers. The first apology being I'm a terrible teacher. I am really bad at education, be it receiving or giving. Secondly, I'm not sure that writing can be taught. I think it is a very complex thing that it basically comes down to a kind of collision between your personality right now and the entire body of work that you've consumed over your life in terms of books and other art forms. And there's nothing you can do about that. You can't change your personality. You can't go back and live your life over and read more books. So I always feel that writing is instinctive and really can't be instructed about. So where I'm really coming from, oh, and the other thing that I have to apologize for is that I'm going to quote some negative examples of things I don't like. And there's bound to be at least 10 people in here who have put that exact thing in their book. So I apologize if I'm ridiculing something that you are very proud of having done. But we'll revisit that point at the end because there's slightly more to it than that. So the topic for tonight that I chose and that Jonathan approved, so really it's his fault. The title is Tell, Don't Show. Why Writing Rules, I can't remember what I said, are mostly wrong or are mostly bullshit or whatever. And the germ for this idea came to me last summer when I was invited to the Harrogate Crime Writers Festival in Britain, and they didn't want to do just another sort of onstage interview thing, so they came up with a format that was based on a British TV show called Room 101, which is a quote from 1984, obviously, and the idea of this show is that you tell your pet hates, and they're adjudicated by a moderator, and if they're sufficiently serious, they are consigned to Room 101. I.e. banished. So I had to come up with 5 pet hates about crime fiction, and this adjudicator would then say whether or not they were sufficiently weighty, and they might or might not be consigned to oblivion. And the argument with the moderator was bizarre. It was, I said to her, I mean, I just met her 5 minutes before the thing, and I said, this is like being married. You ask me to tell you my feelings, I tell you my feelings, and you tell me they're worthless. so the format kind of aggravated me, but one of the things that I came up with, one of the 5 things that I really hate about books when I see it in a book, is where fairly early on in the book, the hero, whoever it may be, is maneuvered into a situation where he is looking in the mirror for some reason. He is shaving possibly or looking in the mirror, and he starts to narrate his features. He's looking in the mirror and he sees the dark, thick auburn hair and the fairly aquiline nose and the jeweling scar that runs diagonally from the corner of his eye and the strong cleft chin. And I'm thinking, give me a fucking break. Because I can make you very few guarantees in life, but I guarantee you this, nobody ever does that for real. Nobody stands in front of a mirror and narrates their own features. They just don't. It's a completely artificial construct, and I don't like it. And I started thinking, well, where does that come from? And it struck me that it came from the fact that writers are universally terrorized by this one very common rule: show, don't tell. They've been told over and over again, you must show, not tell. And that infects everything they do. So they've got a fairly straightforward thing like describing a male human being. And they think, well, I can't just describe him. I've got to maneuver this into some kind of action that's kind of showing. So they get this very artificial thing that the guy stands in front of the mirror and recounts what he sees. And I thought, this has gone too far. This whole, if people are getting that desperate about complying with these rules, there's something wrong with the rules. Because that particular rule, show, don't tell, is so backwards, surely. I mean, the clue is in the words. We are, what are we? We are storytellers. Have you ever heard that word, storyteller? Have you ever heard the word story shower? Has anybody got a kid? Anybody got a kid here? Presumably a few. Have they ever said to you, Mummy, will you show me a story? Have they ever said that? No, telling a story is what we do. There is nothing wrong with telling a story. And if telling means that you have to say, the guy went into the bathroom, he was tall, he had brown hair, he had a big nose, just go right ahead and say it. He had this, he had that, tell the story. There's nothing wrong with telling a story. In fact, telling a story it's a historic art form that has been around for a long time. We do it all the time. We tell stuff, we tell jokes. Like there was this guy, and this woman, they were married, and it was a very good marriage because they communicated a lot about everything. They told themselves and each other everything. She was a teacher, he worked at a pickle factory. So one Friday he gets home from the pickle factory and he says, I have to tell you something. I had this really strong urge to put my penis in the pickle slicer. And she says, well, you didn't do that, did you? And he said, no, of course not. The next Friday he comes home and says the same thing again. I had this really strong urge to put my penis in the pickle slicer. And she says, but you didn't, right? And he says, no, I didn't. The next week he comes home on Wednesday. And he says, I went and did it. I'm sorry, but I put my penis in the pickle slicer. And she said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I got fired. And she said, yeah, but what happened with the pickle slicer? And he said, well, she got fired too. Okay, so there's a little story, right? That you all paid attention to from beginning to end, and it was all telling. Okay, there was no show in there whatsoever. In fact, I don't really see how they could be showing with that particular story. But it was all telling from beginning to end, and it caused nobody any problem. Everybody was paying attention. The suspense kept people going to the end. That was telling a joke. It's no different than telling a story. You should feel absolutely free to abandon that rule. Tell all the time. Because this really goes back to some very basic atavistic feelings. It's not a feeling that I personally experienced because of various random factors, but as I understand it, one of the most comforting things in life is a childhood memory of perhaps curling up in an armchair or on a sofa with your mother telling you a story, right? That is a memory that people cling to and enjoy very much. One human being telling a story to another human being. And one imagines that that is a comforting feeling because it goes back way into prehistory, where, don't forget, we've been engaged telling stories for a long time. Nobody's quite sure how long. We know certain other art forms, we can date them because they leave behind artifacts, like representative painting, possibly 50 or 60,000 years old, music making, possibly 60 or 70,000 years old, based on finding artifacts. And one would assume, therefore, that because storytelling requires no technology, it doesn't require any little flutes made out of animal bones, it doesn't require pigments or little sticks to apply them with, one imagines that storytelling is much older than that. Let's say it could be 100,000 years old. And yet really only in the last 150 years have we become accustomed in the mass market to reading it off a page, reading printed words off a page. That's only about 150 years old for most of us. So on the one hand, you've got 100,000 years of oral storytelling and 150 years of written storytelling. So obviously the oral is a lot more important. And what is that? That means you were sitting down in a small group of people and somebody was telling a story to that group. And the bestsellers in those days were, of course, the most popular storytellers. And how were they popular? They were popular because they had a great voice, literally. And that's another thing where it comes to writing. People talk about voice. as if voice was some kind of a generic or vague word meaning style or something similar to that. And it isn't. Voice is literally a voice. Voice is somebody sitting there opposite you telling you the story. Is their voice engaging? Is their accent pleasant? Is their delivery exciting? That is what a good voice is, and it directly relates to that history of oral storytelling, which also can sort out your point of view for you. That if you are unclear about a point of view, what point of view should you take in a story? Then what you should do is imagine how you feel when you are hearing a story or reading a story. When you're reading a story, you're sitting there in an armchair, okay, in a nice little library. And knee to knee with you is somebody else in an armchair. Now, who is that person? That's the narrator of the story. It could be the person to whom the story has happened, in which case that is first-person narration. It could be somebody that the story didn't happen to, but is a very close friend of the person that it did happen to, therefore you would call that close third person. It could be somebody that had learned all of this extensively at college, and therefore you would call that a distant third person. But that person is in control of the story with a unique viewpoint, and he's looking you in the eye and he's narrating the events. So, and he is not jumping up and down, acting things out. He is just telling you the story. Now that might include dramatic dialogue, it might include description, it certainly might include misdirection and suspense and so on and so forth, but he's not afraid just to sit there and tell you the story. And there are some books that are very like that. There's a book by a writer called Neville Shute, I think called The Pied Piper, and that book starts out in a London club, literally in that library situation, two gentlemen sitting down with a cigar, and one of them starts to tell the other a story. And that's all it is. One person telling a story to another person. And throughout the book it kind of morphs into, as if you were now in Switzerland and France and wherever this story was taking place, but fundamentally it's one person telling a story to another person. And there's nothing wrong with that, so I don't want you to feel like show, don't tell absolutely rules your life. Because first of all, it shouldn't, and second of all, it can't, and third of all, what are they going to do to you anyway? These rules of writing. And you've got to understand where they come from, I think. The rules of writing seem to be, in their current phase, that they're about 11 years old, it seems to me, because they were all started out by Elmer Leonard. In a New York Times article from 2001. It was in a series called Writers on Writing. And I know Elmer Leonard a very little bit, and I know kind of what he's like. And what happened there, I guarantee you this, is that he had this commission from the New York Times. Somebody called his agent and said, "Would you do this for the New York Times?" And he said, yeah, because we all say that. We say, yeah, we'll do that. Because it's safely distant. It's many months in the future. And they're offering you $500 or whatever. So you say, yeah, I'll do that. And then it rolls around, and suddenly you realize, shit, I should be doing that thing for the New York Times. And you look on your calendar, and it was actually due last week. So Elmer Leonard, being who he is, will have at that point thought, Christ, all right, I've got to do this thing. I know what I'll do, because he tends towards brevity anyway. He tends towards kind of an offbeat angle. So he will have said, you know what, I'll just write a list. And what he's really writing is a list of things he likes and doesn't like. But in order to punch it up, he calls it the rules of writing, number 1, number 2. And all he's saying is, number 1 is never open with the weather. And he's saying that he hasn't found a way to open with the weather in his books. That is what he's saying. Because there are plenty of great writers that open with the weather. Alistair MacLean, very seminal Scottish thriller writer, did weather better than anybody. He opened with weather all the time. There's a book called Night Without End, which is essentially a kind of country house mystery, really, but it's set on the polar ice cap, where a civilian plane crashes on the polar ice cap due to engine trouble, quite near a weather station manned by these Arctic explorers. And so the Arctic explorers rescue the people off the plane, but one of them has been murdered. It looks like he's dead from the crash, but actually he's been murdered. So it becomes a limited cast country house mystery, essentially. And that book opens with about 45 pages of weather. And it's absolutely great. So Elmore Leonard is just saying, I've got this deadline to fill. I said yes to this $500 thing. I don't want to spend much time on it, so I'll make it into a list because people will think that is cute. And that has morphed into this, there are rules. Well, no, they're not rules. A rule is something where you get in some way punished if you don't obey it. And again, I can make you very few guarantees, but I will guarantee you this. If you write a bad book, you do not get sent to jail. Nobody fines you. You know, there is no downside to it. If you write a bad book, it might not sell, but plenty of books don't sell. You can't say that only bad books don't sell. So the rules are really paper tigers. And here's another one, you know. People say that in order to create suspense, you have to have characters that people care about. And you put them in a bad situation, and what is going to happen to these characters produces suspense. And I think that's way overcomplicated. And this is edging us into a character-based issue that I'll get into with the next rules. But actually, no, you don't need characters that you care about. What you need is something completely different. And if you want to find out what it is, I'll mention a great example. It's The Runaway Jury by John Grisham. Okay, remember that book. Because he disproves what people are saying. People are saying that you need all these things, the characters that are sympathetic, characters that people like, characters that people worry about. You put them into this situation, you make their situation get worse. In other words, they are casting the question, how do you create suspense? In the same way as you might ask the question, how do you bake a cake? And immediately implies you need some ingredients, okay? It immediately implies that the manner and care with which you mix up those ingredients will be somehow crucial to the outcome. It immediately implies that then it should be somehow cooked, and again, the exact duration and temperature and all that kind of stuff is important and will be critical to the outcome. And all of that stuff is way down a blind alley. It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's not about, you're asking the wrong question. It's not, how do you bake a cake? It is, how do you make your family hungry? And the answer to that is you make them wait 4 hours for their dinner. It really is that simple. What you do, in order to create suspense, forget character, forget all that stuff. What you do to create suspense is you ask or you imply a question at the beginning, and then you don't answer it until the end. And the Runaway Jury proves that, because the Runaway Jury has no nice people in it. It has no characters that we care about. It has bad people and worse people. It has a legal issue that your mind is already made up about. The legal issue is, it's a case about smoking. Is smoking good or bad? Now, your mind is already made up about that. I think smoking is excellent. You may think smoking is bad, but we're not going to change our opinion. So this book has got nothing to do with the essential intrinsic interest of the question, of that legal issue. Our book is about one thing and one thing only. What is the verdict going to be? Is it going to be guilty or not guilty? And you wait 400 pages to find that out, even though you're enjoying none of the people, they're not nice company, you don't approve of what they're doing. I was mad as hell at the poor smokers being victimized. But that central question, will it be guilty or not guilty, is an incredible locomotive that just drives you through that book. And I think actually John Grisham is widely underappreciated. I think he is a very smart guy who experiments a lot and tries a lot of different things. And I think in The Runaway Jury, he was trying to see how pared down, how stripped down can we make a book and still have incredible suspense. And I think that was his answer. Because the power of a question is, humans seem to be hardwired to want to know the answer to a question. It's quite bizarre. I used to work in television, in commercial television. I started in the late 70s and finished in the mid 90s. And in the middle of that, there was a technologically induced revolution right in the middle of that period. Something was invented in the middle of that period, and nobody had it in 1980, and everybody had it in 1990, and it totally changed the way we did business. Okay, now you're all wondering, well, what was this thing? Aren't you? Because I've asked a question or implied a question and I haven't answered it. And I could keep this going for ages, and you would still be interested to know what is this thing that I'm talking about. And of course it is the remote control. Back in 1980, nobody had a remote control, and so you operated on a completely different dynamic, that you could rely on people staying on the sofa while one program finished and the next program started. So that the pressure was off a little bit as to sequencing the scheduling. That you could imagine a sort of 2-3 hour schedule that would flow organically, and you could expect the person to watch it all because they were too bone idle to actually stand up. And believe me, we made a lot of money out of that bone idleness. But then the remote control was invented and people would have it right next to them on the sofa, and that totally changed the dynamic. The end of every program, the end of every part, the beginning of every commercial break was a real danger point, because you knew immediately that they were flipping the channel. So what were you going to do? Well, obviously what you did, scriptwriters would build in bigger and bigger cliffhangers, but ultimately we resorted to a trick that is still there in a lot of sports programming, which is, and you see this in baseball, around usually the middle of the fourth inning, by which time people's initial enthusiasm has worn off, and maybe the game is obviously taken one shape or another. Middle of the fourth inning is a dangerous time in baseball. And so you have the Aflac trivia question, where going into the commercial break, you ask a question. And it can be a ridiculous question. It can be a question that you absolutely don't care what the answer is. It can be a question that you know the answer. It could be who won the Triple Crown in whenever, or who had the most RBIs in 1964, or something like that, and you might know the answer. But especially if you know the answer, then you definitely stick around, because you want to be gratified by being told that you're right. And if you don't know the answer, there is something about the human brain that makes you want to know the answer, even if it's a subject that you're not in the least little bit interested in. So the power of questions and delayed answers, that's the entire key to suspense. And so you can forget all that stuff about sympathetic characters and maneuvering them into dangerous situations where our hearts are bleeding for them. Bullshit. We just want to find out eventually what happens, and the longer you can make us wait, the better. And of course it feels incredibly artificial from the writer's point of view, because you're spinning it out, but you've got to do it. And you've got to do it on a smaller scale, line to line, paragraph to paragraph, chapter to chapter. Even within the space of 2 or 3 lines, if you can somehow suggest something of interest and then not reveal it, even for 2 or 3 lines, that kind of momentum really builds through a book, and that's what people call a page-turner, because you're constantly being prodded ahead or led by the nose to find out what is this. Even though it might be at the end of the actual sentence, it creates an impression of forward momentum. So what I said about character leads me on to another type of thing, which is something that drives me crazy too. I've often heard it said, I don't know if it's a rule exactly or whether it's just advice, but I once heard it said, on every page, one of the characters must want something. Okay? And to me that is, again, shades towards a really, really fundamental misunderstanding of what we're doing, because the characters are not real. okay? They don't exist. They are not capable of wanting anything, or needing anything, or being interested in anything. They are made up. There are only two real people in this transaction that are capable of needing something or wanting something, and they are the writer and the reader. Those are the only people in this equation. Characters are not people. It's not true to say that a character should want something on every page, but it is true to say the reader should want something on every page. You've got to give the reader something on every page, and you can structure what it is that you think they want. They want more information. They want the plot to thicken. They want, in the early parts of the book, they want it to get more and more complicated, more and more weird. In the later part of the book, they want it to become clearer, and gradually they want to see what really happened, what took place. So you've really got to, in my opinion, you've really got to focus on the reader, because a book without a reader does not exist, in my opinion. I think a book is a sort of Zen proposition. You know that thing about if a tree falls in the forest with no one to hear it. Or my personal favorite, if a man speaks in the forest and his wife is not there to hear him, is he still wrong? If a book is written and it is not read, is it actually a book? And in my view, no, it isn't, because it's a transaction. It needs to be written, then it needs to be read, then it exists. So the reader is, in fact, a vital part, an integral part of a book. And you always run, especially a genre author or commercial author like me, you run a risk when you say, think about the reader, because it sounds like I'm just saying, you want to sell well and make a lot of money. And that's really not what I'm saying at all. This is a serious literary existential point, that a book does not exist without a reader. The book does not serve the writer. It just doesn't. I mean, what good does it do a writer to write a book? It's very difficult. It takes a lot of hours and a lot of sweat. It's a pain in the ass, really. The book does not serve the writer. The book is for the reader. And so everything in the book is for the reader. And all this internal stuff about the characters must want something, that is I don't know what that is, some kind of MFA nonsense, in my opinion. The characters don't want anything. The characters are pawns for the writer to give something to the reader. And so on every page, the reader must want something. And it's pretty clear what the reader wants, excitement, more information, sometimes personal information about the character that they've grown to like. I know perfectly well if I'm writing a Reacher book and I put in some line about a childhood experience, something he did when he was a kid or something like that, I know the readers are loving that because they want that. I'm not doing it because Reacher feels the need to reminisce. I really am not. Because it's fixed in my head that, Reacher does not exist, he's not real. And so, Reacher does nothing except to gratify the readers. And I think that's a very key issue to this whole issue. And readers are not dumb. Readers are, it's kind of nice to say readers are intelligent because they're readers. And, that's a flattering thing to say. It's, a place where people show up because they're readers. But audiences in general are very sophisticated. Television soap opera audiences are, generally speaking, considered dumb. But they're actually not. They're very, very smart, because a typical television soap has up to 5 or 6 separate storylines running, with 5 or 6 separate issues, 5 or 6 separate bunches of characters, punctuated by at least 24 hours, often between episodes, sometimes several days. And yet, the soap opera viewers can keep all that in their head, and they can decode everything. They're sensitive to everything. They can filter the parts they're not interested in. They pick up on the parts they like. So really, readers, consumers of any kind of entertainment, are usually very smart and very sophisticated. And I've completely forgotten where I'm going with that point, because I was just thinking about the soap opera issue. Just hold on 1 second while I regroup. Readers are, you've got to take them into account, and you've got to allow them to be your collaborator, essentially. If it's true that a book is created equally by the writer and the reader, which I think it is, although it's that, that sounds extremely artsy and pretentious, because actually the writer does a lot more work than the reader. I mean, let's face it, the writer sits there for months typing out this damn thing. The reader sits there on a comfortable chair with a box of chocolates and reads it in 6 hours or 2 days or whatever. It is in fact the biggest mismatch, the biggest unfairness in the history of the world. I love it when readers come up to me and say, "Oh, I love that book. I read it in one sitting." And I think, I think back to, I always start in September, and I've never finished before the end of February before. So, what is that, like 6 months? I sit there for 6 months, they sit there for 6 hours. Is that fair or what? But they are your partner, they're your collaborators, so you've got to, everything you do is for them. And that's not about commerce and sales and money. I mean, it might be in the long run, who knows, depending on what you're writing. But it's not about that primarily. It's about the transaction. That's how you make a book work. The book is like Frankenstein's monster, and the reader's intelligence, the reader's brain connected to it, is like the jolt of electricity. And if both things are there, it might come alive. Which kind of loops me back to what I was saying at the beginning, that if I have insulted anybody who's put this kind of thing in their book, that they have. Jonathan probably has.
No, I haven't. Thank you so much for that.
But if you have, that might be okay, because here's the only. I've got 2 rules of writing actually. The first one is deadly serious, and that is be very hungry when you write. In other words, do not eat. Okay, literally, be physically hungry when you write. Because I've been in the creative business all my life, one way or another. And anecdotally, I did notice, I've always noticed that I do my best work, well, to be literally truthful, I do my most insanely creative work when I'm stoned. But generally speaking, I do my most consistently creative work when I'm hungry, physically, when I've missed a meal. And I've always noticed that. And then a couple of years ago, I read some medical research which completely validated that point of view, that when we are hungry, a particular creativity center in our brain is fired up, because the idea was when we were primitive animals, if you were hungry, you had to raise your game. You had to find some new way of hunting, or you had to find some new angle to bring down the big beast or whatever, otherwise you would starve. So it's a primitive reaction. Being hungry triggers your creativity. And so I was extremely glad to have that scientific validation, because like I said, I'd always noticed it anecdotally. But my second rule of writing is that this is a very tough business, and it is incomparably tougher now than when I started. I started in the middle 90s, and it was a cakewalk back then. Now it is very, very difficult. Getting your book to the starting line is really all you can do. And what happens after it gets to the starting line is a lot to do with luck and lottery and all kinds of uncontrollable factors. But getting it to the starting line is your responsibility. And the only way to do that is to produce a book that is organic, has integrity, has a living, breathing, beating heart. If you can do that, then the book stands a chance. If what you do, on the other hand, is go on the internet and look up all the rules of writing, and so that you just follow them all, and you have a book that is adverb-free and does not start with the weather, and only has said as an attribution. I use asked as well. I mean, there's an example. I don't use many, but I use said and asked very, very occasionally, possibly answered or replied. Mostly said, but quite a lot of asked. In fact, this afternoon, today I was writing and I put in at least one asked, and I have not been arrested. Elmore Leonard did not come to my house and shoot me. My point is that it is fatal if you're sitting there burning with this idea, knowing exactly what you want to do for this book or for this scene or for this line. You know what you want to do, and there's a voice in your head saying, oh, but I shouldn't do that because Elmore Leonard says I shouldn't, or Stephen King's book says do it differently, or I heard Lee Child speaking and he said do it this third way, or this other guy said don't do it at all, or this guy says do it much later in the book. As soon as you start down that road, you're completely lost. The book will have no beating heart, it won't have vitality, it will be a committee decision, it will be like a laundry list, it'll be utterly dead and utterly cardboard. So my only real writing rule is you are grown-ups, you're not an idiot, you have read lots of books, you know what you like, do exactly what you want to do. Exactly. Even if it contradicts every kind of rule. Even if it contradicts the guy saying, ignore the rules. If coincidentally it happens to match a rule, if that's what you want to do, do it. Because that way, if you write a book exactly as you want to write it, then by definition there is one human being in the world who likes it. Okay? I.e. you. Well, nobody is a unique individual, so that if you like your book, there will be at least hundreds, possibly thousands of other people who like it. That is inevitable, because you're not that different from anybody else. If you've produced a project that you're thoroughly happy with, there will be other people that like it. If you've compromised and done it by committee and paid attention to Elmore Leonard and Stephen King and everybody, admirable though they are, if you have compromised on what you really wanted to do and followed their advice, then you won't like the book and nobody will like the book. So you write the exact book you want, and that gives it that energy. There will be hundreds or thousands, possibly tens of thousands of people who also like it. Whether or not there will be hundreds of thousands or millions of people who also like it is in the lap of the gods. Maybe, maybe not. You know, that's just down to good luck. The luck in this game, people say, oh, you need a lot of luck as a writer, and you absolutely do, but the luck here is not about you meet somebody at a cocktail party who turns out to be an agent, or you're sitting next to somebody on a plane whose brother-in-law is a movie producer. That's not luck. You know, that would qualify maybe as a shortcut or something like that. The luck is, is what you're producing of interest to anybody else? And I've seen this very poignantly with musicians, especially classical musicians. If you show any kind of ability at all at the piano or the violin as a kid, you are fast-tracked onto this, in this channel where you might end up a virtuoso performer. And it can take 15 years or more of learning at Juilliard or wherever in that process. And what you're actually doing in that 15-year process is you are refining your technique to the point where whatever it is you hear in your head, you can reproduce perfectly in the air around you through your physical manipulation of the instrument, so that it's 100% accurate transfer from what is in your head to the sound in the room. And you spend 15 years perfecting that skill. And only then do you find out, is what is in your head worth listening to? And for a tragic number of these guys, no, it isn't. You know, what's in their head is relatively uninteresting. And that is the problem for writers, that you can produce a book that is absolutely what you want it to be. Now, is that of interest to anybody else? And I've said, if you like it, then yes, certainly somebody else will like it, but will a majority of people like it? You just cannot know that. And, you know, that's where it's in the lap of the gods. You know,
I was going to interrupt you and say, would you take a few questions?
Yeah,
On that
absolutely.
note, it's such a
I will take questions, but just to point out, Jonathan at the beginning said, very early he was presented with my first book. And that first book of mine did me so much good. It was a big hit within the community, and it really blazed the trail and set the tone. But that first book, exactly the same book, might have been widely ignored or tried and disliked. It was just pure luck as to whether or not people liked it or not.